Here on New Mexico in Focus, we talk a lot about education. Everyone wants our state's education system to be better, but what does that really mean? Last year, we teamed up with KUNM and Generation Justice to ask students in Albuquerque about their experiences in school. You can find the full report on our website, newmexicoinfocus.org. And there were two key issues that rose to the top in those conversations. Students wanted to see their culture reflected in schools, and they wanted more opportunities to connect with mentors. Producer Sarah Gustavus recently sat down with some local leaders who work in schools or with students to discuss what it might look like to better incorporate the culture of our students into the classroom.
I'm joined at the table today by Diane Torres Velasquez, professor at UNM and president of the Latino Education Task Force. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Christopher Ramirez is director of Together for Brothers. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
Mandisa Rothini is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
And Kara Bobroff is founding principal of the Native American Community Academy, or NACA, and executive director of the NACA Inspired Schools Network. She's also Navajo and Lakota. Thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
I'm going to start with you, Kara. What does it look like to see culture in the classroom at NACA?
Yeah, I think it's really derived from what our community wanted to see in a school for Native students in this large urban area. So some of the things that were, put together in order to establish that goal was to ensure that our students are prepared academically for college, that they have a strong sense of identity, and that they're holistically well. So if you put all three of those things together, you'll see high levels of engagement from students, learning through a lot of rigorous ways around their own identity, their own culture, and their own community. So it could be that we have a middle school student who's in a personal wellness class that's working specifically to identify things that are relevant to young women or young men, and through those lenses that they start to explore their own identity and culture and interest. It could be a graduating or almost graduating junior or senior who's learning about self-determination and sovereignty as it's exercised in both inherently as them as an individual or as a tribe in a formalized way. It could be another younger student learning their language for the first time. So we have a group of students who may be really connected to their culture, and that's part of what their family's been doing at home for a very, very long time. Or it might be a student who's been living in an urban setting, who's been separated from their home community, and for the first time learned something about their identity through a Lakota language class, a Zuni language class, a Navajo language class, Tewa or Tewa, also through Indigenous leadership development and really understanding the importance of core cultural values as it relates to who they are and how they begin to create their worldview and decisions through Native American literature as well as Indigenous science, and also looking at Indigenous education and understanding the historical context of education as it relates to the school that they are now attending. So a variety of different ways and pathways, and a lot of student-led and student-driven learning that takes place.
Diane, what are some examples of incorporating Chicano or Latino culture into the classroom that you think are working in New Mexico?
Well, we have a great dual credit program coming from Chicano Studies, and I say we because it's part of UNM's programs. I'm affiliated faculty with Chicano Studies, and there are a couple of schools where Dr. Vasquez has set up dual credit classes with the teachers, Highland High School, Atrisco Heritage, and Albuquerque High School. And so each of those teachers has a unique background, but they're very much prepared in either Mexican American studies or culinary arts or something that highly lends itself to the study of the studies included in Chicano Studies. And so the students get up to 4 classes if they're eligible. And I think that's one of the model programs that we have in the state. We're the only state now, thanks to Dr. Vasquez's work, that has a graduate program in Chicano Studies. And so we are hoping very much that we will be working together in preparing teachers for these programs and also for the schools. So that's one example. Another is in the courses that we teach. We have a value in our college around diversity. And so I was just in meetings much of last week looking at how we will be examining our curriculum in elementary and secondary ed. And I'm in secondary ed, so we're looking in particular about how are we going to bring in culturally sustaining pedagogy for our teachers. We have one faculty member at least one faculty member who works at Rio Grande High School and works with the teachers there and also works with the students, and that's Dr. Mia Sosa Provencio. And she's doing great things there. So those are 3 examples.
Mandisa, I just saw you nodding your head. Did you want to jump in there and add something?
I just thought it was interesting you were talking about culturally sustainable pedagogy. So, right now, it's in 2017, APS has ethnic studies throughout all their high schools. You can take it through English or through social studies. They have Asian American studies offering Black and African American studies. They have Hispanic, Chicano, and did I say Native American? Yes, and Asian American. The only thing about it, though, is we don't have standards about how does that look, because it's one thing to say we're going to have this in the classrooms, which of course is movement forward, but it's another thing to say, is this actually substantive? Is it being taught in the way that does create movement and connection to what's going on right now? Because these things don't happen in a vacuum. We're not just studying these things because we want to say, oh, we're having multiculturalism and oh, we're having all these different types of things going on in the classroom. No, we want students to be empowered. We want them to have self-determination, and we want them to be making connections to current inequities right now in our state so we can have change. So,
And you're
go ahead.
talking APS?
Yes, I'm talking
Yeah.
APS and UNM.
And UNM.
And UNM.
So that's a really good point you make. I think what we have to be careful with is that although APS is the largest district in the state by far, they are not the only district in the state. And so we have different regions of New Mexico that are urban, rural, have their own personalities and their own context, cultural context. And in my opinion, I think APS went backwards in the way that they implemented ethnic studies by creating a Common Core curriculum guide first. It's not a guide, it's just a simple plan. And then expecting all the teachers to adhere to it. And I realize it's a flexible plan, but I truly believe, because of the other programs that I've looked at and studied, that the success of ethnic studies comes when you really tap into the unique contributions that teacher can make. So knowing you, I would have an idea what kind of program you could develop and what would be the strength of your curriculum. And so I would hesitate to hinge it on the Common Core curriculum standards or any kind of testing that would be standardized, because we really would want to work with you if you were one of the teachers in terms of developing what is right for you and for your students, rather than bringing down a standardized curriculum. So that's the only issue I have with the way that APS has rolled out ethnic studies so far. But I do value, and I am glad to see, and we have a board at APS that has always valued ethnic studies. And so they bring in their own particular interests as well. And I think that's important to how it rolls out as well.
Well, Steph, you want to go ahead, Chris?
I think the other piece that, in terms of talking about bringing culture into the classroom, the challenge of the ethnic studies program in APS, right? We celebrated this idea of having all 13 comprehensive public high schools implement ethnic studies. But unlike what Kara was talking about at NACA, where I see it being infused in every part of the school, out of school time, classroom, the family engagement that you do. In APS, it was introduced as electives, and only classes that made were able to continue. And so if I understand correctly, even this past year, although all 13 schools had the possibility of introducing ethnic studies, it's something like less than a third were able to actually offer those classes. And so what I hear from students, even at the schools that were able to offer ethnic studies, that oftentimes they were not told about those classes. They're only electives, so they were almost in some ways discouraged from signing up for the classes because they were seen as kind of an impediment to what you were talking about either that rigorous academic, like college-going environment. And then I think the other thing I want to bring up that I think is really important, and I know Dr. Torres Velasquez, you've done some work about this, is I think about NACA as being an example because it's a school that the teachers and the staff at the school reflect the community. And we are talking about APS, where, the last time I looked, more than 3/4 of the students are students of color, and we still have a teaching staff that is almost opposite of that. And so part of what I hear you talking about, Dr. Torres Velasquez, is to bring culture in the classroom, we need teachers that look like the community and are not just look like, but are from the community and can really something you said, Kara, like, what does Navajo leadership look like? What does Zuni leadership look like? And so that's like one example. And I think about the power of if we had teachers that really represented the diversity of the city of Albuquerque, our classes would, even the non-ethnic studies classes would have a critical consciousness, would like math and physics and all those other places that sometimes we think we can't include culture. Clearly, there's culture in every aspect of learning, in every aspect of knowledge, and I think that it makes me think about the who's in the classroom, the teacher, the students, the family you can engage, and that's why I love that idea of how I think at NACA it's just infused in every part of the school, and we have some examples of that in APS community schools, where you see some of that even outside of ethnic studies, because it's like it has to be the curriculum, it has to be the staff, it has to be every part of that school, like the posters you see in the school. I think about the last time I visited NACA, they had a indigenous diet inspired like poster on the wall, right? And it's powerful to see as somebody walking into a space that literally even the posters reflect, right, the value of the school.
Yeah. And talking about this idea of if the teaching staff was more diverse, that teachers could be infusing that into every class, and students would be learning from people of all different backgrounds in New Mexico and learning about the contributions of African Americans in New Mexico, the contributions of Native Americans. We could get that into every single class. Christopher, you work with youth in the community. What are some lessons from your work that you think could help improve schools, could help do these things that you're talking about and actually put it into place?
I think a really good example of that is, we work with young men of color and do a 12-week leadership and mentoring program with them. And the curriculum that we use is about making sure they understand racial and gender justice and also community organizing. And to do that, just like Kara was saying, it's about understanding their own identity, but also how their own identity and their subject position as young men of color connects with everybody else in their community. And right, it's that idea of understanding things like intersectionality, but also understanding the privilege that young men have for example, in a recent conversation we had with young men about the man box. And that if we know that young women of color experience some of the most record violence in dating relationships, we know that typically it's young men of color who are perpetrators of that violence. So what can young men of color do to interrupt that violence? Because we know that most violence is committed by young men of color, but not most young men of color aren't committing the violence. So we can interrupt, we can change things, we can start to change culture and behaviors and actions by doing things like interrupting and not just being a bystander. I think the last thing that I just want to share about that idea is what we learn is young people are hungry to talk about and take action on issues of equity and justice in their communities. And sometimes in our classrooms, both in K-12 schools and like Mandisa brought up, even in higher ed, sometimes teachers shy away from talking about these complicated issues like race or sex or gender or sexual orientation. But that young people really want to talk about them, and they want to do more than talk. They want to act. They want to do things. Like I heard Kara said about it's understanding that it's more than things that impact these young people, and they want to talk about it with their families too. They want to talk about it in their community, even outside the classroom.
Mandisa, what are some options you see for doing that in the classroom, bringing that into the curriculum and the classwork?
I mean, there's many different types of options, and I think a great model is NACA. I mean, they're doing these types of things within the classroom, and it goes back to what you flagged, which is a very important issue, because we're not trying to, with ethnic studies, perpetuate a broken education system. It's not just putting it in place and saying, oh, we're offering ethnic studies classes. It's understanding that we're advancing this as a total change in the whole dynamic of education, because we understand that education should not only illuminate what's going on, but it should represent us, and it should change the power dynamics of our society, which of course is kept in place through perpetuating certain histories and how we educate our children. So I think some of the ways that you can bring that into the classroom is us working together, community groups, UNM, continuing these relationships we have between schools. I worked with Africana Leadership Opportunity Team. It's the first and only student group chartered under Africana Studies at UNM. And we saw that there was a need for people who, yes, they're dealing with the core curriculum and all the standardized testing, but like at Ralph J. Bunch Academy, which was the first and only Afrocentric school in the state, it's no longer around, but it's supposed to be Afrocentric. So how do you even create an Afrocentric curriculum? Because right now, even in, not even talking about Black studies at higher ed, because that is having its own issues right now, and it's being attacked by the Trump administration, and it's been having its own issues about being politicized, and do we focus on certain different types of the community and the population? But away from that, when we go into the schools, we go into K through 12, There's issues about even in states where it's mandated, there's not always a committee to enforce it or have oversight. If there is a committee, there's not meaningful participation from the community and from community groups. And in some places, they're finding that teachers are doing things like having mock slave auctions, just things that are just, that's not what we're saying when we say Black Studies. It needs to be a whole change in your mindset and a whole different approach to American history. So I think it's continuing these conversations, as well as finding a way as coming together to maybe create, like at NACA, I mean, you guys have ways to evaluate success. You have benchmarks that aren't about standardizing it, but about supporting so that people know where to start. And also, again, we came from the University of Students, and we got that mentorship from professors like Dr. Jamal Martin and Dr. Khadijah Matthews, and they helped support us to help these teachers at Ralph J. Bunche Academy to create curriculum, and also to help them do the research, because a big need when it comes to Black Studies in New Mexico is the lack of research. So we need to see Africana Studies become a department, which they're trying to do, so we need that community support. We need the university to get on board with that. UNM has an interesting history with ethnic studies, and now that we have this victory with Chicana and Chicano studies, like finally, like it took this long, but we need to be seeing movement in the other programs to departmentalization so that we can start like having people come and we can do research so that there are actual resources to make curriculum from. Sometimes it's hard to find the right histories, it's not written by the right people, and it's not going through the right lens, right? So.
Yeah. Kara, what are some of the lessons from NACA that you're now sharing with other schools and other educators through the NACA Inspired Schools Network?
Yeah, I think one is that one really big thing is the locus of where the school and education originates. And so really thinking about both the land base, but also the community having a huge voice and really identifying what are the values, the outcomes, and the direction they want to see education go. So first and foremost is like true engagement of community in the design of school and learning everything from like what the school's like mission is and goals to how does that actually take place. And then as students and families start to engage in that process, being able to be responsive to whatever those needs are and constantly thinking about how to improve that. I think the second thing is, we talked about teachers a little bit and developing a teacher pipeline. So, when we first started having the conversation about NACA, one thing as other schools are starting to focus on Indigenous education is really like where are the teachers going to come from that are going to be able to implement this, and then if they are in need of professional development, they need the time, they need expertise and people who can help be thought partners along the way, because every single teacher at NACA has really thought super deeply about the curriculum that they developed from an Indigenous perspective. So, the mark of what we're aiming for is that 90% of the students' day is grounded in Indigenous education. And so we get feedback from our students on that question, we get feedback from our families, we get feedback from our staff, as well as the directors and governance and community partners. So I think that's a huge issue, huge thing to be really explicit about. And then also time for them to reflect and be able to plan and align their curriculum using the standards as well. So the other is that there's this holistic approach to wellness, and thinking about 62 different tribes and 18 different ethnicities, and adolescence, and just what goes on with middle school and high school students. They're constantly thinking about, who am I, what am I interested in, who are my friends, who are my families, what do I want to do long term. But all of that to say is having an open, holistic approach to education for students to be able to have the running room they need to really engage in that kind of learning about self and others, intellectually, socially and emotionally, physically, as well as the connection to their community and the relationships within that community has been a big piece. And lastly, I think we see a lot of different schools across New Mexico and also across the nation that we've been working with who are focusing on this question of what is an Indigenous education, is that there's not a single answer to that. And it definitely shouldn't be fragmented to just one aspect of a school that's in existence, but really needs to be holistically grounded into the actual community. Sometimes that's through language, and where there's like a full immersion approach to Indigenous languages. Could be a dual language approach. We have a school that's looking to incorporate Chinatli into their curriculum as well, and thinking about Indigenous identity from an entirely kind of different perspective. And sometimes it's leadership development, and others who have connected it to the history of place through agricultural studies, and really thinking about like where, on the Navajo Nation, this one community is really digging deep on like what is the connection to our agriculture and history, as well as like what are our students learning about their language, their culture, and their identity. So it looks really different as I think about the school up in Santa Clara, the Capo Community School, who's focused on kind of having a more community-minded and Capo-minded education, which I think is really amazing just to have that shift. Like all of us in the school community are thinking about what does that mean for elementary students. So I think it takes place in a lot of different ways, but it really needs to start with the community first. If you think about, you know, the boarding school era and how schools were set up to be standardized around assimilation and like just one size fits all. And I think that there's a real danger in like, what are those structures that are still in place, and how do we start to create schools that are not continuing to perpetuate that even today? So I think that's a larger statewide kind of policy conversation, but it's something that's really important to be able to have this kind of education come to life.
Yeah, so many things to talk about
Yeah.
here, but Diane, can you end it with some final thoughts on what does, with all of this, of looking at these issues, of looking how the education system's working, history, what's happening right now, things that need to be changed, what does that mean for these things that we talk about over and over again about the outcomes for students? How will this help students succeed in school in the ways that are meaningful to them?
When you ask me that question, I think about our state constitution, and in particular Article 12, which has to do with education. And our forefathers wrote in our constitution that they promised our students a sufficient education. And they very clearly valued the culture and languages of New Mexico. When we then became a state, other people from the East Coast came in and kind of took over what was happening in terms of education. And so it's taken us a while to get to the point where I can hear Kara talking about the value of community. And I think that that is the key right there, that we have incredible community members, organizations, leaders who really right now understand what's at risk. And if you look at the data in terms of achievement or in terms of how we measure who we are as New Mexico, you'll see a lot missing in terms of our real value. And so it's one thing to look at the value and look at those numbers in terms of other states. It's another thing to look at who we are as a people, as a group of many peoples, as we evolve into an incredible technology age that we can't even imagine yet. How are we best going to prepare our students at a time where there's going to be the largest divide in economic status that we've ever seen? And where are the moral issues going to fit? Who's going to have control over those issues? So right now, I think it is the best time for us to look at things like ethnic studies, to look at the success of NACA, and to really, truly, honestly, and I mean sincerely involve community, not just as somebody that comes to a meeting once a year, not just as somebody that fills in a survey, but really interactive discussions that are dynamic, where we listen to our real histories critically. The history of our state is fascinating, and there are some incredible pieces that are just coming out in books related to how our history evolved and how those stories were not told. So we need to prepare educators in a way that is also critical, that allows them to critically teach the history, the language, and the culture, along with and certainly valuing what our students bring to the classroom.
Thank you so much. We'll continue the conversation and continue to look into some of these issues, but we appreciate you all coming in this week.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.